Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your program bringing you news, views, updates, and discussion and analysis of religious liberty developments in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on the program is attorney Alan Reinach, executive director of the Church-State Council in California, based in California. And the fact that you're an attorney leads directly into what I want to talk about.
Sure.
You know, the law is a big part of our lives in the modern world. And I'm reminded in the gospel dispensation, you know, the Apostle Paul changed the world on behalf of Christianity, but he appealed to the law time after time, his citizenship status, right? So it seems to me it's a legitimate aspect of living a life of faith in the modern world that we use the law when we can to defend what it offers, in particular in the United States, protection for religious practice. Now, is this a big part or a big problem in the United States, defending people's religious sensibilities, probably mostly in the workplace?
You know, I don't know what most Americans think of when they think of religious liberty problems. Maybe they think of, you know, the baker and the photographer and that sort of thing, or maybe they think of Ten Commandments monuments and, you know, crosses on hills and the battles over those sorts of things. But, you know, the cases that don't get the publicity, the number one religious freedom problem in America today and for many years has been every business day Americans are losing their jobs for no other crime than their faith.
Now, it's not just Seventh-day Adventists. You and I are Seventh-day Adventists, and you, I know, defend many Adventists, but this wouldn't be just a problem of accommodation for Adventists.
No, it's not at all.
I can think of a few others: Jews, Muslims, halal.
But
food, for example.
People of any faith can suffer discrimination. You know, it's true. I started out primarily representing Seventh-day Adventists with Sabbath accommodation problems because of our belief and practice of taking the time from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday as a day of rest and worship and not working on those hours and being pretty strict about, you know, not working. It causes a lot of conflict, especially for blue-collar, hourly wage workers. And
people that
these
can't change a job at will, they don't have the flexibility.
But we've developed the Church-State Council into the foremost legal services organization, providing representation for people of all faiths. So, for example, let me tell you a story about a case that was not a Seventh-day Adventist. And I can tell it because it was a case against a government entity, and when you settle cases against the government, because it's a government, they can't have these non-disclosure agreements. There's no confidentiality.
No, I didn't know that.
I'm not going to use names, you know, but at least I can talk about...
So it's in the public record.
It's a public record, sure. Yeah. So our client was a very lovely gentleman, African-American Baptist. And his dad had started a church in Oakland, California. He had many years of federal service in the military and otherwise, and he decided when the real estate business he was in collapsed back in, you know, 09, 010, yeah. He took a position, very humble position, as a custodian for a national park there on the ocean there in San Francisco. Right by Pier 39, for those who are familiar with the city at all.
I've been to Pier 39 myself, and I'm not familiar with the city.
He encountered not only pervasive harassment and discrimination on the basis of race, but then the thing that got him fired, he had befriended one of the homeless people that came to visit the park, and eventually the gentleman was no longer homeless. You know, he had a place to live, but he still came to visit the park, and he asked my client to be baptized. And so he got very excited. He said, you know, wait till the end of my shift. And at the end of his shift, he took his lunch break at the end instead of during the middle, changed out of his uniform, took him down to the ocean, baptized him. He got fired over that.
Incredible.
You had a federal agency then defending this case you know, they eventually settled it, but defending it, saying we did nothing wrong by firing him. They didn't deny that he was fired over the baptism, because there was a whole paper trail about
so what was the reason given for his firing, though? How did he offend the supervisor?
Look, it was probably just pure bigotry, race and religious bigotry. That's probably what was really going on. They tried to defend it as somehow he would be, people who would see him that was at risk of some kind of endorsement of religion. Well, first of all, he's out of uniform, so how many people are going to recognize that he's the custodian there anyway? And they admitted on deposition testimony that, well, it was perfectly legal for him to do it on his day off, so how do they know if he was working or if he's on his day off? You know, and you go down to the beach there, and there's lots of people doing all kinds of things on the beach. This is San Francisco, after all, you know, and nobody's paying any attention. My son's girlfriend, we had a baptism at the beach down in Malibu a couple years ago, and we had a loudspeaker, you know, so we could hear the service and what have you. And I'm looking around while the preacher is introducing things, and he's preaching and he's reading from the Bible. I'm looking around. There isn't a soul on the beach that's paying a lick of attention.
Interesting.
You know, so it was absurd that there was any kind of fear that that anyone is going to look at this lowly custodian and imagine that because he's baptizing somebody in the ocean. First of all, what's a baptism? They're going down in the water and coming back up, and does anybody even, they're not singing, they're not praying, they're not doing anything, you know, to publicize it.
Private prayer.
Right? You know, the idea that this would be an endorsement of religion by the United States government, this lowly African-American custodian, is just ludicrous. So, you know, but so I tell that story just as an illustration that religious discrimination can happen to anybody and to everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're a majority faith, minority faith. You know, we talk about, for example, laws against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Well, guess what? Gays are not the only people who have a sexual orientation. You and I have a sexual orientation. It's not the same, you know, as a gay person, you know, but so anybody can be discriminated against. And we found, as we have gotten the experience and grown, that we're getting calls for help from across the board, from Muslims being harassed, from Jews, from, you know, Christians of other faiths. We've got those not working on Sunday, and of course, still predominantly a lot of Seventh-day Adventists with Sabbath problems.
And it seems to me, I don't know whether the numbers of this sort of thing have gone up, but the types of cases are bureaucratic a lot. And I just wonder if the litigious nature of the U.S. has made employers fearful of any sort of activity like this, and then they're just sort of jumping on it. Because it's obvious that 50, 60 years ago, or further, let's say 100 years ago, religious activity by employers informally in the workplace wouldn't have got anyone's attention very much. But since, you know, at the drop of a hat, people are sued. Maybe even the government in this case and others just don't want any trouble, so they're sort of pushing it away reflexly where they might not have done that before. Do you think there's an element of that?
I think there's a certain hostility to religion that we see. I don't know that I would attribute
that has
it
developed
to government.
Too. No, not by government, but government happened to be.
I mean, look, most of our cases are private employers. Are not, you know, we do have some government cases, but again, it's people who are harassing. It's people who are discriminating. You know, they're in positions of authority within the government or within companies, but it's people. You know, we may yet have to file another case against Federal Express. Well, we've had some previously. Federal Express has policies like all these companies do against discrimination, but it's people who are failing to follow the policies.
Yeah, and it's true. Tolerance in our society for everything, including religion, is at a low point. The battle lines are drawn very quickly, and people get up in arms that they don't like what's going on, or they're frosty about some criticism of their actions. So I'm sure this is feeding through into more litigation on Sabbath, in our case, accommodation.
Well, you know, part of the story when it comes to the Civil Rights Act and the national protections we have against religious discrimination in our laws has to be a faulty view of the separation of church and state, of the Establishment Clause. The first case that went to the Supreme Court back in the 1970s that was decided was applying the obligation to accommodate the religious practices of employees. It involved a mechanic for TWA. Remember TWA? Correct. TWA against Hardison. And one of the arguments made on behalf of TWA was that having special rules to accommodate people of faith was an establishment of religion, that this violated the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court did not go that far, but they watered down the obligation. It was, the statute reads that employers have to provide reasonable accommodation short of an undue hardship. Well, the court watered down undue hardship and deprived it to practically nothing.
De minimis.
De minimis, exactly. De minimis, which means pretty much bupkis.
Nothing.
Right. Now, we have been successful in California and in a couple of other states at adopting a different standard that was first done with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a significant difficulty or expense standard of undue hardship. And we've been pushing for 2 decades to get this standard written into Title VII at the federal level, and neither party has been especially helpful in pushing this forward.
And we might have discussed it in the past, but I think what's getting in the way more and more is this tilt by the Supreme Court to recognizing the rights and writing them large for corporations. A corporate think goes against the individual rights. And as well as that, I've heard in particular the Roman Catholic Church stating, and from a legitimate point, but I don't like to hear it in view of what's happening with the civil idea of corporations. They state that there needs to be less fixation on individuals' conscience rights and more on corporate rights for the church. This corporate think bothers me.
Well, there's no question that we have always had a bias in our laws that favors...
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. was founded on corporations, was settled with corporations before independence.
And yeah, there is an imbalance in favor of the corporations. Like I say, some of our state laws, in California, we've made enormous headway in crafting a set of laws that really does provide vigorous protection for people of faith in the workplace. I'll tell you, the nut that we need to crack right now, and we're on the verge of cracking it in California, has to do with what can employers ask in the hiring process. When you ask about availability, and increasingly there are online job applications.
Trying to filter it out before you're even offered
If you don't say you're available 7 days a week, you just get bounced out of the application process.
It's a very important aspect. We'll come back to that. Let's take a short break and come back and we'll discuss ways that perhaps people are being pre-screened before the job's even offered, where they might have religious accommodation issues. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider before the break with Alan Reinach. You had just brought up the fact that many big firms particularly are sort of inserting weaselly questions in there to ferret out.
Well,
mixing my animals.
It's not weaselly.
Well, they're doing it with a bad intention. With my son, I've been with him while he's filled these out, and I know what they're doing, to try to flush out whether or not you want accommodation.
Let's be blunt, Lincoln. Wage-working people in America are not human. They are widgets in the corporate machine. And they don't look at your personality, they don't look at your gifts, they just want people who will obey, 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 follow the rules, you know.
Yes, and I know, I see the questions.
Color between the lines,
and they
so
come
to
out
speak.
in any number of ways. Will you do what we say and not question authority and so on?
They want you to be available 7 days a week, you know, jump how high. Target is terrible this way. Target refused to hire my son, who had a positive work history from when he was in school. They were hiring teenagers for summer jobs. They don't give them more than maybe 12 hours a week. So why was it significant that he wouldn't work 1 out of the 7 days a week? And that was the reason that the store manager would not hire him, after the assistant manager thought he was an upstanding, respectful, well-spoken, you know, had a good employment history. He was perfectly hireable, and they rejected him because of 1 day out of the week.
And they said that?
They said that. They're totally ridiculous. Now, we didn't wind up filing that. I told him you could make your whole summers, you know, just sit with me for 15, 20 minutes, we'll file, but I wasn't going to do it for him. You know how parents are. Kids have to show some initiative, you know.
Yeah, I'll throw it in for discussion's sake, because you and I have other thoughts on this topic, but I wonder sometimes if it hasn't worsened in the workplace because of the weakening, most particularly under Reagan, of the trade union situation.
Well, you know,
workers' rights are not defended generally as they once were.
You know, this is kind of a mixed bag for us, Lincoln. It's true that union rights are weaker than they were. Collective bargaining agreements often make it much more difficult to accommodate a Sabbath observance, a schedule. If you don't have the seniority, it can be very difficult to work around that. We have a case right now against AT&T. Our client was hired in a wireless store, and because of seniority rules, it was very difficult to accommodate him there, and he wound up being fired for attendance issues. What AT&T did not do was say, oh, well, it's kind of hard to accommodate you here, but we have all these call centers with 10 zillion people in them, and you know, you can try your hand there and get swaps, you know, because there's more people to swap with if you have an unfavorable schedule, and it's going to be a lot quicker before you earn enough seniority to get a favorable schedule. And he'd been at a call center before and had been accommodated. But, you know, the rule is, well, you know, we have a rule, you can't change jobs, can't transfer until you've been here for 6 months, and they managed to fire him before he'd been there for 6 months. So, you know.
Well, then tell me another question. I mean, and our Seventh Adventist heritage has brought with it a deep suspicion of the role of trade unions. And so, you know, that's what I was referring to. There's good reasons for someone with an individual conscience position to not deliver that to the disposition of a trade union that in its own way may restrict your rights.
You know, I have to say, Lincoln, I think that Adventist Church has been one-sided here. When I read Ellen White, I read her to have you know, concerns about trade unions, certainly, but also concerns about the abuse of corporate power and the consolidation of
and we need to keep that in mind, because we tend to be one-sided in our application of that advice.
Exactly. And clearly there is considerable oppression of labor from the corporate side today.
And the Bible that I read gives us one of the clear markers of the end times, that the workers' wages are held back by fraud.
Right, in James 5.
Right. But another thing that I sometimes wonder hasn't skewed it against religious accommodation are these states, and I don't know offhand how many, with right-to-work laws.
So the workers' rights community has long been opposed to these right-to-work laws. There's been a real push for just cause. You know, the problem is we treat labor as a commodity.
That's what I don't like about
we don't
the
treat
right to
people as, you know, we don't value people. You have large corporations, for example, that depend upon the quality of their workforce for their entire economic model, like the large delivery firms, and yet they treat their workers like they're widgets, and they will throw them out. They're just numbers and what have you. It's really the way we treat people. There's no wonder the Bible rails against the oppression of labor in the last days. It is a sign of the last days.
Yeah, and you know, there's not too many discussions that I've heard on the merits of capitalism versus communism, which is discredited and largely gone. But we tend to think it's gone, it's discredited, capitalism is great. There's elements of capitalism that are distinctly un-Christian, especially the way it's carried forward, and I think this is one part of it. It shouldn't be, in pursuit of money shouldn't be used to drag to drag down or repress the rights of an individual. Well, the Bible says the workman is worthy of his hire.
To me, there is a fatal flaw in the way capitalism is currently established here in the United States, and that is that the rights of capital are supreme as against the rights of labor. You know, the workers are the ones who are actually producing the profits that the people who have the capital get to sit back and not work for it, invest, and enjoy the fruits of somebody else's labor.
Now, it sounds very communist or socialist to say that, but that's just a dynamic structural fact. It's nothing to do with ideology. But I think morally, the Bible does speak to this. We need to be careful not to be, in the case of an employer, not to be abusive toward the trust relationship that should exist.
Well, look, I think there are other models that a free society and a free economy can have that better balance the interests of capital and the workforce, that reward labor for their productivity. You know, what we've had in the last generation is a hollowing out of the middle class. The rich get richer and the working class gets poorer. It used to be that, you know, the head of household, the man, could support the family.
No, it's not anymore.
Can't happen anymore.
Predicated on two incomes, typically.
And two incomes are still struggling to support the family in many cases.
And, you know, I don't know that that's any master plan, but I think from a point of morality, we need to resist the tendency that that's created to if not mistreat, then to disregard the rights of the worker. And back to our starting point, litigation to support moral and religious stands by people, I think it's suffering because of this, isn't it?
Well, and look, I'd like to make one point here before we close this out, because there are a lot of Christian organizations that are very belligerent. You know, you better do what we say is right or we're going to beat you up in court. Our approach, I have always called biblical peacemaking. We have conflicts, we encourage companies to do the right thing, we express our confidence that they will do the right thing. They get a letter from a lawyer, they know what's going to happen if they don't. We don't need to rub their noses in it. But, you know, what we like to do then is try to get their attention, get their cooperation, resolve conflict as early as possible. But God has given us a legal system to resolve conflict.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I kind of like to close with this illustration of what turn the other cheek means, because I think many people think it means being a doormat. Well, far from it. You know, our natural tendency when we get to conflict is fight or flight. Either we're going to punch somebody back or we're going to run away. Well, if we turn the other cheek, we're not doing either one. We're not running away. We're not hitting them back. We're really confronting their wrongdoing and giving them an opportunity to rethink it. And I think that's what we do when we bring these religious freedom claims. It's a matter of confronting what a company has done wrong. The only way they're going to make it right, they're not going to admit anything. Maybe they'll put up some money to settle a case. But in rare occasions, we actually get to accomplish more than that. And they'll do training and we'll get somewhere in terms of eradicating discrimination.
It's amazing how often the Bible uses what amounts to legal imagery. There's the accuser of the brethren standing off to the side, when someone's brought before the great judge, of course, he is a judge, but also we have an advocate, Jesus. And I think that gives some justification, some background to what happens every day somewhere in the world, and particularly in the United States, where people depend upon lawyers and advocates against the secular legal system to uphold their profession of faith. It is important. It's something that we do gladly, and we take full advantage of whatever legal help there can be. And of course, when all of that is exhausted, we serve the Lord, and our legal authority is before Him. We should never lose sight of that. But like Paul, using his citizenship as a tool, if not a weapon, to proclaim throughout the Roman Empire, so too we can use the law to our advantage. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.